Sometimes the greatest warriors are brought to their knees, not by sword or spear, but by the sight of a lost child who reminds them of their own broken heart. In that moment, all the battles fought and blood spilled mean nothing compared to one simple choice: walk away, or become the father you never had the chance to be. Einar the Old Wolf finds a mysterious girl with no hair, no name, and no shoes wandering alone through burned ruins. She doesn't speak his language, and his clan calls are cursed, but he takes her in anyway. What starts as mercy becomes a bond that changes them both. As they travel dangerous lands together, this unlikely pair discovers that family isn't about blood, it's about who you choose to protect. But what secret does this silent girl carry that could change two worlds forever? Before we jump back tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the ghosts of old battles, and Einar the Old Wolf stood at the edge of his longhouse, watching the sun struggle through clouds that had seen too many winters. His weathered hands gripped the worn handle of his father's axe, the same weapon that had carved his legend across distant shores and painted his name in the sagas of fearsome men. Yet this morning, like so many others in recent years, the weight of it felt different, heavier, not with the promise of glory, but with the burden of a life that had grown too familiar with endings. At 60 winters, Einar's shoulders still carried the breadth of a man who had pulled oars through storm-tossed seas and wielded steel against the shields of emperors. His beard, now more silver than gold, bore the careful braiding of a warrior who still took pride in his appearance, even when the wars seemed to be winding down. The scars that mapped his arms and chest told stories of battles from the fjords, of Norge to the walls of Constantinople, each one a reminder of a younger man's hunger for fame and fortune. But fame, he had learned, was a fickle companion. Fortune could be lost in a single bad harvest or foolish gamble. What haunted him now, in the quiet moments between raids and clan meetings, was the memory of what he had lost while chasing both. "Still brooding like an old bear, are you?" Astrid's voice carried the familiar mixture of affection and exasperation that had characterized their friendship since childhood. She emerged from the longhouse, carrying a wooden bowl of porridge, her own grease-streaked hair braided in the practical style of a clan woman who had buried 2 husbands and raised 3 sons to be warriors. "Reflecting," Einar corrected, accepting the bowl with a nod of gratitude. "There's a difference, is there?" She settled beside him on the wooden bench that overlooked the fjord, her presence both comforting and challenging in the way only old friends could manage. "Because from where I sit, you've been doing a lot of this reflecting, and not much else." The porridge was warm and thick with honey, a luxury that spoke to their clan's recent prosperity. 3 successful raids in as many seasons had filled their coffers and their bellies. Yet Einar found little satisfaction in either. He ate slowly, tasting memories alongside the grain. Ingrid had made porridge like this, back when the longhouse had echoed with a child's laughter instead of the low conversations of warriors planning their next venture. "The young ones speak of spring raids," Astrid continued when he didn't respond. "Olaf claims there are Saxon monasteries along the eastern coast that haven't been touched. Rich pickings, he says." "Olaf speaks of many things," Einar replied, his tone carrying the weight of a man who had heard similar boasts from too many young warriors, who thought glory was something that could be harvested like wheat. Most of them proved to be wind and wishful thinking. But even as he spoke the words, Einar felt the familiar stirring in his chest, the call that had driven him to sea for more than 4 decades. It wasn't greed anymore, or even the love of battle. It was something deeper, more troubling. It was the fear that without the raids, without the purpose they provided, he would have nothing left but memories of a wife and daughter whose faces grew dimmer with each passing season. "The eastern settlements have been quiet," Astrid observed, watching his expression with the shrewd eyes of a woman who had learned to read men's hearts through their silences. No word from the trade routes in months. Some say the silk merchants had found other paths to the western kingdoms. This was news that should have concerned him more than it did. The trade routes brought wealth to their lands, and wealth brought stability. But stability, Einar had discovered, was another word for the slow death of purpose. He finished his porridge and set the bowl aside, his gaze following the flight of gulls as they circled the fjord in their eternal search for sustenance. "You think too much of the past," Astrid said gently. "Ingrid and little Freya, they wouldn't want you to waste the years you have left mourning the years you've lost." The names hit him like physical blows, though he kept his expression steady. Ingrid, who had died birthing their second child in a winter so harsh that even the priests had called it cursed. Freya, barely 5 summers old, taken by the fever that had swept through their settlement the following year like a ghost army claiming victims with invisible weapons. They lay beneath stones carved with runes that promised their reunion in Valhalla. But 15 years had done little to ease the ache of their absence. "I don't mourn them," he said, though they both knew it was only half true. "I honor them." "And how does sitting alone at dawn honor anyone?" She challenged. "Your clan needs leadership. The young warriors look to you for wisdom, not brooding. And you need purpose beyond the next raid." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention toward the path that wound down from the hills. 3 riders emerged from the morning mist, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with the urgency that marked bearers of important news. Einar recognized them immediately. Bjorn the Red, his nephew and one of the clan's most trusted scouts. Eric One Eye, whose missing left eye had been the price of information that had saved them from a Saxon ambush 2 summers past. And young Gunnar, barely 17 but already marked by the restless energy that drove all young Norsemen toward glory or death. "Uncle," Bjorn called as he dismounted, his voice carrying the breathless quality of a man who had ridden hard through the night. "We bring word from the Eastern Territories." Einar rose, feeling the familiar shift in his posture as the mantle of leadership settled around his shoulders. This was the part of himself that still felt young, still felt vital, the commander who could read the tides of war and politics like a sailor reading the winds. "Speak." "The monastery settlements along the Volga have been raided," Eric reported, his remaining eye bright with the anticipation of conflict. "But not by any clan we know. The villages are burned, the people scattered or dead. Whoever did this wasn't interested in slaves or ransom. They left nothing alive. This was unusual. Viking raids, for all their fearsome reputation, followed certain unwritten rules. Slaves were valuable, ransoms could be negotiated, and even the most brutal warriors understood that live subjects were more useful than corpses. A raid that left only death suggested either madness or a purpose beyond mere wealth. "What of the trade routes?" Astrid asked, stepping closer to join the conversation. As one of the few women who regularly attended clan meetings, her questions often cut to the heart of matters that the men, focused on glory and battle, might overlook. "Blocked," Gunnar replied, his young voice trying to sound older and more experienced than his years allowed. "The merchant ships won't sail the eastern rivers. They speak of armies moving through lands that have known peace for generations." Einar felt the old familiar tingle along his spine, the sense that greater currents were shifting, that the careful balance of power and trade that had brought prosperity to his people was beginning to fracture. It was the same feeling he had experienced before the Great War between the Saxon kingdoms, before the rise of Charlemagne's empire, before each of the major conflicts that had shaped his adult life. "How far east?" he asked. 3 days' sail up the river, Bjorn answered. "Maybe 4 if the winds are poor. The last fishing village before the trade route split toward the the Byzantine territories. Einar nodded slowly, his mind already calculating distances, supplies, and the number of warriors he could muster without leaving his own settlement defenseless. It had been 2 seasons since their last major expedition, and the young men were restless with the energy of unused strength. This could provide the outlet they needed, while also serving the practical purpose of assessing whatever new threat had emerged in the east. "We'll sail within the week," he decided. 20 men, provisions for a fortnight. If these raiders are still in the area, we'll deal with them. If they've moved on, we'll at least have word to carry back to the other clans. The decision felt right in a way that his recent choices had not. Purpose flowed through him like mead through a thirsty man's veins, warming him from the inside and chasing away the melancholy that had plagued his recent mornings. This was what he was meant for, not brooding over past losses, but facing present challenges with the strength and wisdom that 4 decades of survival had earned him. As the scouts departed to spread word of the expedition and begin preparations, Astrid remained beside him, her expression thoughtful. "You're pleased," she observed. "I'm useful," he corrected. "There's a difference, is there?" she asked again, echoing her earlier question but with a different inflection. This time, he heard the understanding in her voice, the recognition that a man like Einar, shaped by conflict and honed by constant challenge, could not simply lay down his weapons and tend sheep in his declining years. "Perhaps not," he admitted, allowing himself a rare smile. "But useful or pleased, the result is the same. We have work to do." The morning mist was lifting from the fjord, revealing the clear waters that would carry them toward whatever fate awaited in the eastern territories. Einar felt the weight of his father's axe shift against his hip, no longer a burden, but a tool ready for use. Whatever they found among the burned settlements and blocked trade routes, he would face it with the strength that remained to him and the wisdom that only comes from surviving long enough to understand the true cost of glory. Behind him, the longhouse stirred with the activity of preparation warriors, checking their weapons, women preparing provisions, children wide-eyed with the excitement that always accompanied the departure of a raiding party. It was a scene he had witnessed and orchestrated hundreds of times, yet today it felt different. Today, it felt like the beginning of something, rather than simply another repetition of familiar patterns. He didn't know, as he stood watching the sun burn away the last of the morning mist, that this expedition would bring him face to face with a choice that would reshape not only his understanding of fatherhood and honor, but the very foundation upon which he had built his identity as Einar the Old Wolf. He didn't know that in 3 days' time, among the ashes of a burned village, he would find not just evidence of a raid, but a reason to remember what it meant to protect rather than conquer. All he knew was that purpose had returned to him like blood flowing back into a limb that had grown numb, and for the first time in seasons, the weight of his father's axe felt like a promise rather than a burden. The smell reached him. Before the sight did, smoke and ash mixed with something sweeter and more terrible that every warrior learned to recognize. Death had a scent all its own, and it hung over the fishing village like a shroud woven from despair and flame. Einar's longship cut through the gray waters of the river bend. 20 seasoned warriors, silent at their oars, as the scene of devastation revealed itself. Through the morning haze, what had once been a thriving settlement was now a collection of blackened timber and scattered stone. The wooden docks that should have bustled with fishing boats and merchant vessels floated broken and half-submerged, their charred planks reaching toward the sky like the ribs of some enormous beast. No gulls cried over it. Even the scavengers had found nothing here worth claiming. "Mother of Thor," Bjorn whispered from his position at the steering oar, his normally steady voice tight with something between anger and awe. "What kind of men do this?" Einar said nothing, but his weathered hands gripped the ship's rail until his knuckles showed white against the sun-darkened skin. He had seen the aftermath of raids before, had participated in more than he cared to count, but this was different. Viking raids, even the most brutal ones, followed certain patterns. They took what could be carried, enslaved those who might prove useful, and left the rest to rebuild or flee. This looked like the work of men who raided not for profit, but for the simple pleasure of destruction. They beached the longship on a stretch of muddy shore that had once been someone's carefully maintained landing. The warriors filed out in practiced silence, hands resting on sword hilts and eyes scanning the ruins for any sign of movement. But the only sounds were the gentle lapping of river water against charred wood, and a distant call of crows that had found richer hunting grounds elsewhere. "Spread out," Einar commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had kept men alive in battles from the Irish coast to the walls of Constantinople. "Look for survivors, supplies, anything that might tell us who did this. Stay within shouting distance." The men moved through the ruins with the careful efficiency of wolves exploring unfamiliar territory. Einar himself walked toward what had once been the village's central hall, his boots crunching on fragments of pottery and glass that caught the weak sunlight like scattered stars. The building had been substantial, once large enough to host clan gatherings and important enough to warrant carved wooden posts that spoke of prosperity and pride. Now it was a skeleton of blackened beams reaching toward a sky that seemed too bright for such darkness. It was there, in the shadow of a collapsed grain storehouse, that he saw her. At first, he thought it was a bundle of discarded cloth, something dropped in the haste of evacuation or the chaos of the attack. But then the bundle moved, a slight shifting that spoke of life in a place where death had claimed dominion. Einar approached slowly, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt to force something in the child's posture. The careful way she held herself, ready to flee or fight despite her obvious exhaustion, made him stop. She was perhaps 10 summers old, though the gauntness of prolonged hunger made exact judgment difficult. Her head had been shaved clean, whether by choice or force he couldn't tell, and her feet were bare despite the cold ground. The clothes she wore were little more than rags, torn and stained with smoke and mud and things he preferred not to identify. But it was her eyes that stopped him, cold, dark, and watchful, and filled with a silence so profound it seemed to echo in the empty spaces around them. She didn't run when she saw him, though her small body tensed like a bowstring drawn taut. Instead, she watched him with the wary intelligence of a creature that had learned survival through stillness and observation. There was something in her gaze that reminded him of looking into a still pool at twilight depths that seemed to hold more than they revealed. "Easy, little one," he said softly, using the gentle tone he had once employed with young horses and injured hawks. He crouched down slowly, making himself smaller and less threatening, his hands visible and empty. "I'm not going to hurt you." The words meant nothing to her, he realized immediately. Her expression didn't change, but something in the tilt of her head suggested she was listening to the sound rather than searching for meaning. She spoke no Norse, that much was clear. But she understood tone, and perhaps that would be enough. He tried a few words in Saxon, then in the trade tongue that most merchant settlements understood. Nothing sparked recognition in those dark eyes. On impulse, he attempted a greeting he had learned during his time in the eastern markets, a phrase in the language the silk merchants used. Still nothing, though she seemed to be cataloging each attempt with the careful attention of someone who had learned that information could mean the difference between life and death. It was when he reached slowly toward his belt that she moved, quick as a startled deer, scrambling backward until she pressed against the broken wall of the storehouse. But instead of fleeing entirely, she stopped there, watching to see what he would draw from his weapons. When his hand emerged, holding not steel, but a piece of hard bread from his travel supplies, confusion flickered across her features. For the first time since he had found her, he broke the bread carefully, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. then placed half of it on the ground between them before stepping back. The child stared at the offering as if it might transform into something dangerous, but hunger the kind of deep, gnawing hunger that came from days without food eventually overcame caution. She darted forward, snatched the bread, and retreated to her position against the wall, where she ate with the desperate efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste time or opportunity. As she ate, Einar noticed other details that painted a clearer picture of her recent trials. The calluses on her small hands spoke of hard labor, while the way she favored her left leg suggested an injury that had healed poorly without proper care. Most telling of all was a small object that caught the light when she shifted position, something that looked like carved stone or perhaps metal, hanging from a thin cord around her neck and hidden beneath the torn fabric of her clothing. "Einar!" Bjorn's voice called from somewhere behind him, thick with excitement and discovery. "You need to see this." The child's head snapped toward the sound, and for a moment Einar saw something besides wariness in her expression, a flicker of fear, so sharp and immediate that it made him wonder what she had witnessed during the attack on this settlement. Whatever it had been, the sound of approaching men still triggered memories that made her small frame tremble despite her obvious efforts at control. "Stay here," Einar told her, though he knew she couldn't understand the words. Instead, he pointed to the ground where she sat, then to himself, then made a gesture he hoped conveyed that he would return. To his surprise, she seemed to understand, giving him the smallest of nods before pressing herself more firmly against the wall. He found Bjorn examining what remained of the village's defensive works, a wooden palisade that had been reduced to scattered stakes and ash. But it wasn't the destruction itself that had excited his nephew. It was the weapons embedded in the remaining posts, arrows with distinctive fletching, spear points crafted in a style he didn't recognize, and most significantly, fragments of armor that bore markings in a script none of them could read. "These aren't Saxon," Eric One-Eye observed, pulling an arrowhead from a charred beam and examining it with the professional interest of a man who had been struck by similar projectiles. "Not Danish either, or Irish. Look at the metalwork. This is Eastern craftsmanship, but not Byzantine." Einar studied the evidence, his mind working through possibilities and implications. Eastern raiders operating this far from their usual territories suggested either a significant shift in the balance of power or something valuable enough to draw them across vast distances. But what could a simple fishing village possess that would warrant such attention? The answer, he realized with growing certainty, was currently huddled against a broken wall, eating bread with the careful intensity of someone who had learned to treasure each crumb. The child hadn't simply survived the attack, she had been its target. Everything else, the destruction and death that surrounded them, had been the price of trying to claim or kill one small, silent girl. When he returned to the storehouse, he found her exactly where he had left her, though she had finished the bread and was now watching his approach with renewed wariness. The fragment of whatever hung around her neck caught the light again, and this time he was certain it was jade, the greenstone prized by the Eastern merchants and worth more than gold in the right markets. "Who are you, little one?" he asked softly, knowing she couldn't answer but needing to voice the question that was reshaping everything he thought. He understood about this raid, and what makes you worth burning a village to find. She looked up at him with those dark, knowing eyes, and in them he saw an echo of his own daughter's gaze, not in feature or coloring, but in the essential quality of innocence marked by loss. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, followed immediately by a wave of protective instinct, so fierce it surprised him with its intensity behind him. His men continued their investigation of the ruins, their voices carrying fragments of speculation and professional assessment. Soon they would finish their survey and expect to hear his decision about their next move. The logical choice was clear: report back to the clan, share intelligence about these unknown Eastern raiders, and prepare defenses for their own territories. Taking the child would complicate everything, mark them as targets, and potentially bring war to their own doorstep. But as he looked down at her small, determined face, Einar felt the weight of his father's axe shift against his hip. No longer a symbol of past glories, but a tool for protecting something precious and fragile. The choice, when it came to him, felt like inevitability, not the grand gesture of a hero from the sagas, but the quiet decision of a man who had finally found something worth defending more than he feared the consequences. "Come then," he said, extending his hand toward her with the same careful patience he had shown wild things throughout his life. "Let's see if we can't find you somewhere safer than this." She stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, then slowly, carefully, placed her small fingers in his weathered palm. The jade pendant swung free as she moved, catching the light and confirming what he had already begun to suspect, that this silent, barefoot child carried secrets that stretched across continents and might very well reshape the fate of both their peoples. The journey back to the fjord stretched longer than usual, weighted by the presence of a silent passenger who sat in the bow of the long ship like a small monument to mysteries that none of them could solve. The child, for Einar, had begun thinking of her simply as that, the child, until something better presented itself, watched everything with the focused attention of someone cataloging details for future survival. Her dark eyes tracked the movement of clouds, the flight patterns of birds, and most intently, the faces and gestures of the 20 warriors who had become her unwitting guardians. Einar had wrapped her in his own traveling cloak, a thick wool garment that dwarfed her small frame but provided protection against the river's chill. She accepted it without protest, though she kept the jade pendant carefully hidden beneath the fabric. Precaution that spoke to hard-won wisdom about the value of seeming to have nothing worth taking. "The men are asking questions," Bjorn said, quietly, settling beside his uncle as the familiar outline of their home fjord appeared through the afternoon haze. "They want to know what we plan to do with her." It was a fair concern, and one that Einar had been wrestling with throughout the return voyage. Viking society had clear protocols for dealing with captives, slaves, and refugees, but none of them seemed to fit the situation they faced. The child was obviously not a prisoner of war. She had come willingly and posed no threat. But neither was she a typical refugee, fleeing violence with hopes of finding sanctuary among strangers. There was something deliberate about her presence in that burned village, something that suggested she had been specifically sought rather than simply caught in the chaos of a raid. "We'll present her to the clan council," Einar replied, though the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. "Let the elders decide her fate according to tradition." But even as he said it, he knew that the traditional responses, slavery, ransom, or expulsion, would not serve in this case. The child's obvious intelligence and the quality of her hidden jade ornaments suggested she came from a background of some importance. More troubling still was his growing certainty that the raiders who had destroyed her village would not simply abandon their pursuit. Taking her in might very well be inviting war to his own doorstep. The child herself seemed to understand that they were approaching something significant. As the longship rounded the final bend and the settlement came into view, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing along the shoreline, the familiar bustle of daily life, she sat straighter, her small hands gripping the sides of the boat. When several of the younger villagers came running to greet the returning warriors, she pressed herself back against the mast, clearly overwhelmed by the noise and activity. "Easy," Einar murmured, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. The touch seemed to calm her slightly, though she remained tense as they guided the ship to its mooring. "These are my people. They won't harm you." The words were more hope than promise, he realized. Viking communities were not known for their gentle treatment of outsiders, particularly mysterious ones who arrived under unusual circumstances. But Something in his tone must have conveyed reassurance, because she looked up at him with those dark, serious eyes and gave the smallest of nods. The crowd that gathered to welcome them home was larger than usual, drawn by curiosity about the expedition, and eager for news from the Eastern Territories. Einar helped the child from the boat, noting how she stayed close to his side as they made their way up the path toward the longhouse. Her bare feet moved silently over the familiar stones, and she kept her head down, avoiding the stares and whispered comments that followed their progress. Astrid was waiting at the entrance to the great hall, her expression shifting from welcome to surprise to concern as she took in the sight of their unexpected guest. "Einar," she said carefully, "what have you brought us?" "Trouble, most likely," he admitted, appreciating her directness, "but also, perhaps, an opportunity to do something right." The child seemed to sense that they were discussing her, though she couldn't understand the words. She looked between Einar and Astrid with the wary intelligence of someone trying to read intentions, from tone and gesture. When Astrid crouched down to her level and offered a gentle smile, the child didn't retreat, but neither did she respond with anything approaching warmth. "She's been through something terrible," Astrid observed, noting the signs of hardship that were written in the child's posture and the careful way she held herself. "How long since she last had a proper meal?" "Days, at least," Einar replied, remembering how desperately she had eaten the bread he had offered. "Perhaps longer. The village where we found her had been burned completely, no survivors except for her." Word of their return spread quickly through the settlement, and by evening, the longhouse was packed with clan members, eager to hear the tale of their expedition. Einar recounted the discovery of the burned village and the evidence of unknown raiders, but he found himself editing the story as he spoke, downplaying the child's significance and presenting her rescue as a simple act of mercy rather than a decision that might reshape their future. The child herself sat beside him throughout the telling, wrapped in clean clothes that Astrid had provided and eating slowly from a bowl of stew. She listened to every word, despite not understanding them, her attention focused on the faces around her as if she were memorizing each person for future reference. When some of the younger warriors spoke of tracking down the Eastern raiders for revenge, she grew very still, and Einar noticed her hand move instinctively to the hidden pendant at her throat. "What do we know of her origins?" asked Thorvald the Elder, the clan's most senior advisor and a man whose opinion carried significant weight in council decisions. "She's clearly not from our lands, but beyond that?" "Nothing certain," Einar replied, though he was becoming increasingly convinced that the jade pendant held answers to questions they hadn't yet learned to ask. "She speaks no language that any of us recognize, and she's been too frightened to attempt much communication." This was not entirely true. Throughout the day, the child had shown remarkable adaptability, watching and learning from everything around her. She had already begun to associate certain Norse words with their meanings, and her attempts to mimic simple phrases suggested both intelligence and a gift for languages. But Einar found himself reluctant to share these observations, sensing that her apparent helplessness might be her best protection against those who would see her as either a threat or an opportunity. "The question," Thorvald continued, "is what we do with her now. We cannot simply ignore the possibility that harboring her might bring those raiders to our doorstep." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled clan members, and Einar felt the weight of their expectations settling on his shoulders. These were his people, and their safety was his responsibility. But as he looked down at the child still, eating with the careful attention of someone who would learn not to waste food, he felt the pull of a different kind of responsibility. "I propose we keep her through the winter," he said finally, the words carrying the authority of a man who had led them through countless challenges. "Give her time to recover, to learn our language, to tell us more about these raiders and what they wanted. Come spring, we can make a more informed decision about her future." It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offered something to everyone. The child would have shelter and protection through the harsh winter months, while the clan would have time to assess both the threats and opportunities her presence might bring. And perhaps, Einar thought but did not say, the winter would give him time to understand why the sight of one lost child had awakened something in him that he had thought buried with his wife and daughter Dot. As the crowd dispersed and the longhouse settled into the quieter rhythms of evening, Einar found himself sitting by the fire with the child still close beside him. She had finished her meal, but remained alert, watching the play of flames with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. In the firelight, her features seemed less gaunt, more reminiscent of the healthy child she might become. With proper care and time, on impulse, he reached into his traveling pack and withdrew a piece of birch bark and a stick of charcoal, tools he sometimes used for marking maps or recording information during expeditions. He spread the bark on the floor between them and began to draw, starting with simple shapes and figures that might transcend language barriers. The child watched with growing interest as he sketched a rough map of their journey, the fjord, the river, the burned village where he had found her. When he pointed to the village and then to her, she nodded, confirming his understanding. Then, to his surprise, she reached for the charcoal with a gesture that asked permission rather than simply taking what she wanted. Her drawing was crude, but remarkably detailed for someone so young. She began with the burned village, adding structures and details that he had missed or forgotten. Then she drew figures, small shapes that clearly represented people, and began to tell a story in pictures that words could not convey. Einar watched, fascinated, as she illustrated her journey from some distant place, across what appeared to be vast distances, to the village where he had found her. The crude map on birch bark became their first real conversation, a bridge across the chasm of language and culture that separated them. And as she drew, adding details and corrections to his initial sketch, Einar began to understand that the child he had rescued carried knowledge that stretched far beyond the simple tragedy of a burned village. She had traveled farther and seen more than most seasoned warriors, and the story she was trying to tell through pictures and gestures suggested that her true journey was only beginning. Winter settled over the fjord, like a familiar friend returning from a long journey, bringing with it the kind of deep cold that drove even the hardiest Norsemen to huddle close to their fires and tell stories of warmer days. For the child, who had finally shared what sounded like a name, though none of them could pronounce the complex series of sounds that emerged when she pointed to herself, the season brought both safety and a growing sense of belonging that surprised everyone, including Einar himself. He had spent the better part of a morning carving the wooden horse, working the pale birch with the same careful attention he had once devoted to shaping spear shafts and shield bosses. The craft of woodworking required patience and precision, qualities that came naturally to a man who had learned to repair his own weapons during long campaigns far from friendly shores. But this project felt different, more personal somehow, invested with hopes and intentions that had nothing to do with warfare or survival. The child watched him work from her place beside the fire, her dark eyes following each cut and curve, as the rough block of wood gradually took the shape of a small horse. She had grown healthier during her weeks among them, her face filling out and her movements becoming less cautious, though she still started at sudden noises and kept careful track of the exits from any room she entered. "Almost finished," he murmured, more to himself than to her, as he used a small knife to carve the details of mane and saddle. The horse was crude compared to the elaborate toys that wealthy jarls might commission for their children, but it was sturdy and smooth to prevent splinters, designed to withstand the enthusiastic play of young hands. When he finally set down his tools and held up the completed carving, the child's reaction was everything he had hoped for and more. Her eyes widened with genuine delight, and for the first time since he had found her, She smiled, not the careful, measured expression she wore when trying to please adults, but the unconscious joy of a child presented with something wonderful and unexpected. "Horse," Einar said carefully, pointing to the carving and then repeating the word. Over the past weeks, their shared vocabulary had grown steadily, built through gestures, drawings, and patient repetition. She was remarkably quick to learn, absorbing Norse words with an efficiency that suggested either natural talent or extensive practice with languages. "Ross," she repeated, her pronunciation heavily accented but recognizable. Then she added something, in her own tongue, a musical phrase that probably meant the same thing. She reached for the toy with obvious eagerness, but stopped herself, looking up at him with a question in her eyes. "For you," he said, placing the wooden horse in her small hands. "Yours." The concept of ownership seemed to confuse her initially. She examined the horse from every angle, her fingers tracing the carved details as if she were trying to memorize them. Then she looked back at Einar with an expression that held both gratitude and something that might have been wonder, as if the idea of being given something simply for the joy of having it was foreign to her experience. "Thank you," she said in careful Norse, the words still awkward on her tongue but unmistakably sincere. Then she added something else in her own language, a phrase that carried the weight of formal gratitude and suggested that wherever she came from, courtesy and proper manners had been important parts of her education. The wooden horse quickly became her most treasured possession, never far from her side during the day and carefully placed beside her sleeping furs at night. But more than that, it seemed to represent a turning point in her relationship not just with Einar, but with the clan as a whole. The sight of her playing quietly with the toy softened even the most skeptical hearts, and gradually the whispered complaints about the burden she represented began to fade. It was Astrid who first noticed the child's knowledge of healing herbs. The discovery came by accident during a particularly harsh storm that kept everyone confined to the longhouse for 3 days. Young Gunnar had developed a persistent cough that grew worse despite Astrid's usual remedies, and the clan's healer was visiting relatives in a distant settlement. The child had been sitting quietly by the fire, making her wooden horse gallop across imaginary landscapes, when she suddenly stood and approached Astrid with purposeful determination. She tugged at the older woman's sleeve and pointed toward the herb stores, then began a series of gestures that seemed to indicate she had knowledge that might help. Skeptical, but desperate enough to try anything, Astrid allowed the child to examine their collection of dried plants and prepared medicines. What happened next astonished everyone present. The child quickly identified several herbs, rejecting Astrid's initial choices in favor of a combination that no one in the settlement had ever tried. She demonstrated the proper proportions through careful hand gestures and even showed them a brewing technique that seemed to involve timing and temperature considerations that their usual methods ignored. The remedy worked. Within hours, Gunnar's cough had eased, and by the following day, he was breathing clearly for the first time in weeks. Word of the child's healing knowledge spread quickly through the settlement, transforming her from a potential burden into a valuable asset that the clan could ill afford to lose. Where did she learn such things? Astrid wondered aloud as they watched the child return to her place by the fire, apparently content to resume her quiet play as if nothing unusual had happened. That combination of herbs, I've never seen anything like it, yet it worked better than any remedy in our stores. Einar had no answer, but he was beginning to piece together fragments of a larger picture. The child's knowledge seemed to extend far beyond what any ordinary villager might possess. Her understanding of herbs suggested formal training, perhaps, in the court of some Eastern ruler, where medicine was treated as a scholarly pursuit rather than simple folk wisdom. Combined with the jade pendant she still kept hidden and her obvious education in languages and manners, it painted a picture of someone born to privilege and power rather than the simple fishing village where he had found her. but it was her response to a challenge from one of the older children that truly revealed the depth of her transformation. Eric's son Leif, perhaps jealous of the attention she had been receiving, had snatched the wooden horse and threatened to throw it into the fire. Instead of crying or retreating, the child had stood her ground with a quiet dignity that reminded Einar of Jarls he had known, men and women who commanded respect through presence rather than bluster. She had spoken to Leif in firm but polite Norse, her words carefully chosen despite her limited vocabulary. When he continued to threaten her toy, she had simply extended her hand and waited, her dark eyes holding his until he grew uncomfortable and returned the horse without further protest. It was a display of leadership that came from within, the kind of natural authority that could not be taught or faked. "She's not what she appears to be," Einar confided to Astrid later that evening, as they watched the child teach some of the younger clan members a game that involved moving small stones in complex patterns. Whatever tragedy brought her to that burned village, she didn't start life as a refugee. "Does it matter?" Astrid asked pragmatically. "She's here now, and she's becoming one of us. The children accept her. The adults respect her knowledge. And you," she paused, studying his face with the shrewd perception that came from decades of friendship, "you found something you thought was lost forever." It was true, though Einar found it difficult to admit even to himself. The protective instincts that had died with his own daughter were stirring back to life, awakened by this strange child who carried herself like nobility and played with a wooden horse like any village girl. The thought of sending her away in the spring, of fulfilling the clan's agreement to reconsider her fate when winter ended, had become increasingly unthinkable. But outside the warmth of the longhouse, beyond the growing acceptance of his people, danger still lurked in the wider world. Whoever had destroyed that village in their search for her had not simply vanished. They were still out there, still hunting, and when spring came, the trails would be passable again. The wooden horse might represent his commitment to fatherhood, but it also served as a reminder that the most precious things were often the most fragile, requiring protection that even the strongest warriors sometimes couldn't provide. As he watched her carefully place the carved toy beside her sleeping furs that night, Einar offered a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, that the peace of winter would last long enough for him to find a way to protect this gift that had been placed so unexpectedly into his hands. The ice began to crack along the fjord's edges as winter slowly loosened its grip on the land, and with the changing season came the first real test of the bonds that had formed during the months of shared warmth and growing trust. It arrived in the form of nightmares that shattered the peaceful quiet of the longhouse and left everyone wondering what horrors lived in the memories of a child too young to carry such burdens. The dreams came without warning in the darkest hours. Before dawn, piercing the communal sleep with cries that seemed to originate from someplace deeper than simple fear. Einar woke to the sound of the child calling out in her own language, words that carried the desperate urgency of someone pleading for mercy or trying to warn of approaching danger. Her small body thrashed against the sleeping furs as if she were fighting invisible attackers, and the terror in her voice was so raw and immediate that several warriors reached for their weapons before fully awakening. "Easy, little one," Einar murmured, moving quickly to her side, but careful not to touch her until she was fully conscious. Experience with battle-scarred veterans had taught him that touching someone in the grip of nightmare memories could trigger violent reactions that put everyone at risk. "You're safe. You're here with us." The child's eyes snapped open, wide and unfocused, seeing threats that existed only in the landscape of sleep and memory. For several long moments, she stared at Einar without recognition, her breathing rapid and shallow like a trapped animal. Then, gradually, awareness returned to her gaze, and she seemed to realize where she was and who surrounded her. "Sorry," she whispered in Norse, the word heavily accented but sincere. She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, trying to erase the tears that had come with the dreams. "Sorry, wake everyone?" "No need for sorry," Astrid said gently, settling on the child's other side with a cup of warm milk sweetened with honey. "We all have bad dreams sometimes. The important thing is that you're safe now." But as the nights passed and the nightmares continued with increasing frequency and intensity, it became clear that these were not the simple fears of childhood, but something far more complex and troubling. The child's cries often included what sounded like warnings, urgent phrases repeated with the insistence of someone trying to save lives. And sometimes, in the confused moments between sleep and waking, she would speak of fires and running and people who wouldn't listen to her pleas for escape. Thought it was during one of these episodes that Einar finally understood the true nature of what they were dealing with. The child had been deep in nightmare when she suddenly sat up straight, her eyes still closed but her voice clear and commanding as she spoke rapidly in her own language. The tone was unmistakably that of someone giving orders, someone accustomed to being obeyed, and the phrases she repeated had the formal cadence of court speech rather than common conversation. When she finally woke completely, she found Einar sitting beside her with an expression of deep concern and growing understanding. "You saw it happen," he said quietly. Not really a question, but a statement of fact that had crystallized during her dreaming. "The attack on your village, you were there when it began." The child stared at him for a long moment, then slowly reached beneath her sleeping furs to withdraw something she had kept hidden since her arrival. It was not just the jade pendant he had glimpsed before, but a small collection of objects, carefully wrapped in a piece of silk that had somehow survived her long journey. Among them were several ancient Chinese coins, their surfaces green with age but their inscriptions still clearly visible. "From home," she said simply, spreading the objects on the sleeping furs between them. The coins caught the firelight, reflecting it back in patterns that spoke of craftsmanship and value far beyond their metal content. Very far. Einar examined the coins carefully, noting the quality of their manufacture and the complexity of the characters inscribed on their surfaces. He had seen similar pieces in the hands of the Eastern merchants, who occasionally traveled the trade routes, but these seemed older, more formal, the kind of currency that might be used in imperial courts rather than common markets. "Your family," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Important people?" The child nodded, her expression growing solemn in a way that made her seem far older than her years. She pointed to one of the coins and spoke a phrase in her own language, then repeated it in halting Norse. "Father's house." The implications were staggering. If the child was indeed from a family wealthy enough to possess such coins, her disappearance would not go unnoticed. Somewhere across the vast distances that separated their fjord from the eastern territories, people would be searching for her. And if the raid on the fishing village was connected to her capture or elimination, then those same people might very well be the ones leading the search. "The men who burned village," Einar said carefully. "They look for you?" Fear flickered across her features, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. She nodded again, then gathered up the coins and pendant with movements that spoke of long practice at concealing valuable things. "They want," she struggled with the Norse words, then switched to gestures, pointing to herself and making a cunning motion across her throat. The message was clear enough, and it transformed everything, Einar thought. He understood about their situation. This was not a simple refugee who had fled a random raid, but a specific target whose elimination was worth burning an entire settlement to achieve. The fact that she had escaped and evaded capture for what must have been weeks or months spoke to both remarkable courage and considerable intelligence. "How long?" he asked. "How long they chase you?" The child held up her hands, spreading her fingers to indicate numbers that Einar had to interpret through gesture and context. From what he could understand, She had been fleeing for at least 2 full seasons, possibly longer. The scope of her journey began to come into focus, a trek across vast distances, through territories and cultures that most people never saw in their entire lives, all while being hunted by enemies who had shown they were willing to kill anyone who helped her. The ancient coins represented more than just wealth or status. They were proof of identity, perhaps the kind of documents that could legitimize claims to power or territory. No wonder her enemies had been so determined to find her. And no wonder. She had learned to trust no one, to hide her true nature beneath the guise of a simple village child who had lost everything to raiders' dot as she carefully rewrapped her treasures and returned them to their hiding place. Einar felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like armor before battle. The child's presence in his household was no longer just a matter of clan politics or personal inclination. It was a decision that could bring war to their doorstep and endanger everyone he had sworn to protect. But looking at her small, serious face as she tucked the silk bundle back beneath her sleeping furs, he also felt something else. The fierce protective instinct of a father who had been given an unexpected second chance at the most important job in the world. The ancient coins might mark her as valuable to empires and armies, but to him, she was simply the daughter he had thought he would never have again. "Sleep now," he told her gently, settling back into his own furs but positioning himself so that he remained between her and the longhouse entrance. "Bad dreams come. I stay here. You safe?" The child looked at him with an expression that held both gratitude and something that might have been wonder, as if the concept of safety was so foreign to her recent experience that she wasn't sure she could trust it, even when it was freely offered. But gradually, her breathing deepened and her small body relaxed. One hand curled protectively around her wooden horse, while the other remained close to the hidden treasures that connected her to a world of power and danger that felt as distant as the stars. Outside, the wind carried hints of spring and the promise of open waterways that would soon make travel possible again. But inside the longhouse, beside the dying fire, Einar kept watch over dreams and memories and ancient coins that told a story of empires and exile, of a child who had crossed the world to find safety in the arms of an aging warrior who had never expected to be a father again. Spring arrived with the sudden violence of ice breaking free from winter's grip, and with it came the kinds of changes that made even the most seasoned warriors uneasy. The child's nightmares had grown more frequent and detailed, painting pictures of palace corridors and betrayal that left little doubt about her true origins. But it was the discovery of the silk scarf fragment, hidden so carefully in her hair, that even Astrid's gentle ministrations had failed to find it, that finally confirmed what Einar had begun to suspect. The revelation came during what should have been a moment of simple pleasure. The child, who had tentatively begun calling herself Liu when pressed for a name, had been helping Astrid prepare the morning meal when a particularly vigorous head shake dislodged something small and lustrous from the dark strands at the base of her neck. The fragment was no larger than a man's thumb, but the quality of the silk was unmistakable, woven with threads that caught the firelight like captured moonbeams. "May I?" Astrid asked gently, holding out her hand with the patient courtesy that had gradually earned the child's trust. Liu hesitated, then nodded, allowing the older woman to examine the fragment more closely. What Astrid saw there made her draw in a sharp breath. The silk was not just fine quality, it was imperial quality, woven with gold thread in patterns that spoke of court workshops and royal looms. But more telling still were the symbols embroidered along one edge, tiny characters that clearly represented some form of official marking or identification. "Einar," Astrid called quietly, her voice carrying the weight of significant discovery. "You need to see this." When Einar examined the silk fragment, he felt the last pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with an almost audible finality. Combined, with the ancient coins and the jade pendant. This small piece of fabric painted a picture that was both clearer and more dangerous than anything he had imagined. Liu was not simply nobility, she was imperial nobility, connected to the highest levels of power in whatever distant kingdom she had fled. "Palace," Liu said quietly when she saw them examining the silk, the Norse words still careful on her tongue, but unmistakably accurate. She pointed to herself, then to the fragment, then made a series of gestures that seemed to indicate great size and importance. Father's house, very big. The implications rippled through Einar's mind like stones thrown into still water. If Liu was indeed connected to an imperial court, her disappearance would be more than a family tragedy. It would be a political crisis that could reshape the balance of power across vast territories. The men who had burned the fishing village in their search for her were not common raiders or bandits, but agents of some faction that saw her elimination as necessary for their own survival or advancement. "How many people know you're here?" he asked Astrid, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Word of the mysterious Eastern child had spread throughout their settlement and beyond, carried by the inevitable gossip that connected even the most remote communities. "Too many," Astrid replied grimly. "The story has reached at least 3 neighboring clans, probably more." And with spring opening the trade routes again, she didn't need to finish the thought. Merchants, travelers, and seasonal workers would soon be moving freely between settlements, carrying news and stories across distances that winter's isolation had temporarily protected. If anyone was actively searching for Liu, they would eventually hear about the strange child who had appeared in Einar's household, just as mysteriously as she had vanished from her original life. The danger became immediate and personal. 3 days later, when Born returned from a trading expedition with news that chilled the blood of everyone who heard it. Strangers had been asking questions in the coastal settlements, well-dressed, men who spoke multiple languages and offered significant rewards for information about a missing child matching Liu's description. "They're not merchants," Bjorn reported to the hastily assembled clan council. "These men move like warriors, trained and disciplined. And they're asking very specific questions about a girl with no hair, traveling alone, possibly carrying valuable objects." The description was too accurate to be coincidental, and the systematic nature of the search suggested resources and organization far beyond what common bandits could command. Liu's enemies had not only survived the destruction of the fishing village, they had expanded their search and were now working their way methodically through every settlement and community within traveling distance of where she had last been seen. "How long before they reach us?" Thorvald asked, his weathered face grave with the weight of decisions that could determine the fate of their entire community. "Days, perhaps a week, if we're fortunate," Bjorn answered. "They're being careful, thorough, but they're also getting closer." The clan fell into uneasy silence, each member wrestling with the implications of harboring someone who had become a magnet for deadly attention. Some of the younger warriors spoke eagerly of the honor to be found in battle, but the older voices carried the wisdom of experience that understood how costly such honor could prove. It was Liu herself who broke the deadlock, standing from her place beside Einar with the composed dignity that had become her hallmark. She had been listening to the entire discussion, despite the complex Norse vocabulary involved, her quick mind filling in gaps through context and gesture. Now she addressed the assembled clan in careful but clear words that carried the weight. A formal pronouncement. "I go," she said simply, her young voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "Bad men look for me, not you. I go. You safe." The offer was both brave and heartbreaking, spoken with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had learned to carry burdens far too heavy for her years. But it also revealed something else, the natural authority of someone born to leadership, making decisions based on the welfare of others rather than personal safety. "No," Einar said firmly, his voice carrying the absolute finality of a father's protection. "You stay. We find another way." But even as he spoke the words, he knew that the options were limited and time was running short. Liu's pursuers were closing in with the inexorable patience of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. The spring that had brought freedom of movement to honest travelers had also freed those who traveled with darker purposes, and the isolation that had protected them through the winter months was rapidly disappearing. That night, as the clan settled into uneasy sleep, Einar found himself standing watch beside Liu's sleeping place with a vigilance that had nothing to do with normal guard duties. The silk fragment lay beside her wooden horse, both treasures representing different aspects of the remarkable child who had transformed from refugee to daughter in the space of a few short months. She slept restlessly, her dreams filled with palace corridors and betrayal, while outside the longhouse, the sounds of spring carried hints of approaching footsteps and the kind of choices that would define not just her future, but the future of everyone who had chosen to protect her. The ancient coins and jade pendant marked her as valuable to empires, but the silk fragment told a different story of a child born to power who had learned that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in claiming what was yours by right, but in walking away from it to protect those you had come to love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and harder decisions. But tonight, under the watchful eyes of an aging warrior who had rediscovered the meaning of fatherhood, Liu slept as safely as anyone could in a world where ancient loyalties and imperial ambitions collided in the lives of ordinary people who had never asked to be part of such grand and terrible games. The strangers arrived on a morning when the fjord waters ran smooth as polished silver and the air carried the deceptive peace of early spring. There were 5 of them, traveling in a single boat that bore the marks of long voyaging, but none of the honest wear that came from merchant work. Their leader was a man of middle years, with the kind of careful stillness that spoke of extensive training in violence, while his companions moved with the coordinated precision of soldiers who had learned to function as a single deadly unit. Einar watched their approach from the shore, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt, while his mind catalogued details that might prove crucial in the hours to come. The strangers' weapons were well maintained but deliberately understated. Their clothes spoke of wealth without ostentation, and their manner suggested men who were accustomed to getting what they wanted through a combination of diplomacy and implied threat. "We seek the child," their leader announced without preamble as soon as his feet touched the wooden planks of the dock. His Norse was fluent but accented, suggesting origins in the Eastern territories, where trade and warfare had created a complex mixture of languages and cultures. The lost princess who was taken from her rightful place. "We have come to restore her to those who love her." The words were carefully chosen, designed to present their mission as rescue rather than capture. But something in the speaker's tone set Einar's teeth on edge. He had heard similar phrases from Saxon lords who spoke of protecting villages while stripping them of everything valuable, and from merchants who claimed friendship while calculating the exact price of betrayal. "Many children live here," Einar replied carefully, his own voice carrying the neutral courtesy that experienced warriors use when testing the intentions of potential enemies. "Perhaps you could be more specific about who you seek." The stranger smiled, an expression that never quite reached his eyes. "A girl child of perhaps 10 summers, with the dark features of the eastern lands. She would have arrived recently, possibly injured or frightened, carrying little but perhaps bearing marks of her noble birth." The description was accurate enough to eliminate any doubt about their purpose, but it was what the man didn't say that revealed the true nature of their mission. He spoke of restoration and love, but made no mention of ransom or negotiation. There was no suggestion that Liu's family was desperately searching for her, no offer of reward for information about her welfare. Instead, there was only the quiet, certainty of men who had come to complete a task that they viewed as both necessary and inevitable. "I am afraid we have seen no such child," Einar lied smoothly, though he knew the deception would not survive serious scrutiny. Too many people had witnessed Lu's arrival and integration into their community for her presence to remain secret long. The stranger's smile widened slightly, taking on the predatory quality of a wolf that had scented wounded prey. "Perhaps we might speak with your clan elders. Important matters sometimes require the wisdom of those who have seen many seasons." It was a reasonable request that Einar could not refuse without seeming deliberately obstructive, though every instinct screamed that allowing these men deeper into their settlement would be a mistake of potentially fatal proportions. He led them toward the longhouse, noting how their eyes cataloged every detail of the community's layout and defenses with the professional interest of soldiers preparing for siege. Inside the great hall, Thorvald and the other clan elders received the strangers with the formal courtesy that Norse hospitality demanded, offering food and drink while carefully avoiding any commitment to their requests. But it was Liu's reaction that revealed the true nature of their visitors in a way that no amount of diplomatic conversation could have accomplished. She had been helping Astrid with the serving when the strangers entered, moving quietly among the gathered men with the unobtrusive efficiency she had learned during her months among them. But the moment she saw their leader, her face went white as winter snow, and the wooden cup she had been carrying slipped from nerveless fingers to shatter on the stone floor. The sound of breaking pottery cut through the polite conversation like a blade through silk, and in the sudden silence, everyone present could see the terror that transformed Liu's features from those of a confident young girl into something wild and hunted. She took an instinctive step backward, her dark eyes wide with recognition and the kind of fear that came from intimate knowledge of exactly what these men were capable of doing. "Ah," the stranger said softly, his voice carrying a satisfaction that confirmed Einar's worst suspicions. "Princess Lu Wei, how very far you have traveled from your father's house." The formal address hit the gathering like a physical blow, confirming not only Lu's true identity, but also the fact that these men knew exactly who she was and why she had fled so far from her original life. The leader rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, but there was something in his posture that suggested a hunter who had finally cornered his quarry. "Your uncle has been very worried about you, child," he continued, his tone carrying the false warmth of someone delivering news that he knew would be unwelcome. "The kingdom has been in turmoil since your disappearance. Many people have suffered while searching for their beloved princess." The mention of her uncle sent a visible shudder through Liu's small frame, and she shook her head with the desperate intensity of someone trying to deny an unbearable truth. "Uncle dead," she whispered in Norse, her voice barely audible but carrying absolute conviction. I see soldiers come. Uncle send men kill father, kill mother, kill everyone. Only me run." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, painting a picture of palace intrigue and family betrayal that transformed everything the strangers had said into lies wrapped in diplomatic courtesy. Liu had not been taken from her rightful place. She had fled from it when that place became a death trap orchestrated by the very people who now claimed to love her. "Children often misunderstand what they see," the stranger said gently, though his eyes had grown hard as winter ice. "Grief and fear can make memories unreliable. Your uncle wishes only to restore you to your proper place and ensure that such confusion never troubles you again." But Liu was no longer the frightened child who had huddled against a broken wall. In a burned village, months of safety and care had allowed her natural courage to resurface, and she faced her would-be captors with the dignity that was her birthright. Slowly, deliberately, she reached beneath her clothing and withdrew the object that had remained hidden throughout her time among them, not just the jade pendant Einar had glimpsed, but an elaborate ring bearing the carved seal of imperial authority. "This, my father's seal," she said clearly, holding the ring so that its intricate carving caught the firelight. "This make me empress if father dead. Uncle want, cannot have. I choose who rule after me." The revelation struck the assembled clan like a thunderbolt, recontextualizing everything they thought they understood about the child they had sheltered. Liu was not simply imperial nobility. She was the rightful heir to an entire empire, carrying in her small hands the power to legitimize or destroy the claims of those who sought to rule in her place. The stranger's mask of diplomatic courtesy finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation that had always lurked beneath his polite words. "The ring belongs to your family, child. Your uncle is the natural regent until you reach your majority. Return it willingly, and no one else need suffer for your confusion." The threat was clear, though wrapped in language that maintained the pretense of civilized negotiation. But Einar had heard enough threats in his lifetime to recognize this one for what it was, a promise of violence directed not just at Liu, but at anyone who continued to stand between her uncle's agents and their prize. "The child stays here," he said quietly, his words carrying the finality of a man who had made a decision from which there could be no retreat. "She is under my protection, and that of my clan." The stranger turned toward him with the slow deliberation of a serpent selecting its strike. "You would risk war with the Celestial Empire for the sake of one confused child. Your people will pay a heavy price for such misguided chivalry." "Perhaps," Einar acknowledged, feeling the weight of his father's axe shift against his hip like an old friend preparing for battle. "But that is our choice to make." What followed was a silence that stretched taut as a bowstring, filled with the weight of consequences that would reshape the lives of everyone present. Liu stood between two worlds, the empire that had birthed her and the clan that had chosen to protect her, while men who had never asked to be part of such grand conflicts prepared to face the armies of distant kingdoms for the sake of a child who had become infinitely more precious than any of them had imagined. The imperial seal ring caught the firelight as Liu carefully returned it to its hiding place, and in that gesture, Einar saw not just the end of her anonymity, but the beginning of a conflict that would test everything he had ever believed about honor, family, and the price of doing what was right in a world where might too often triumphed over justice. The strangers departed with the cold courtesy of diplomats who had delivered an ultimatum, leaving behind them a silence that felt heavier than the worst winter storm. They took nothing from the settlement except measurements, the distance from shore to longhouse, the number of fighting men, the layout of defenses that had been built to repel raiders rather than trained soldiers carrying imperial authority. Their leader's final words echoed in the still air long after their boat had disappeared around the fjord's bend. "We return at dawn. The child comes with us, or everyone pays the price of defying the Celestial Empire." Einar stood at the water's edge until the last ripples from their departure had faded into stillness, his weathered hands gripping the worn handle of his father's shield, retrieved from storage with the grim recognition that the time for peaceful solutions had passed. The shield bore the scars of battles fought across half the known world, its iron boss dented by Saxon axes, and its rim scored by the weapons of men whose names had been forgotten by everyone except the ghosts that haunted old warriors. "Dreams, uncle?" Bjorn's voice carried the weight of questions that needed answers before the sun set on what might be their last day of peace. "What are your orders?" The question hung in the air like incense from a funeral pyre, demanding a response that would determine not just the fate of one lost princess, but the survival of everyone who had chosen to call this fjord home. Einar turned away from the water, feeling the familiar weight of command settle across his shoulders, like armor that had never quite fit but had become indispensable through decades of necessity. "Send riders to the allied clans," he commanded. his voice carrying the authority that had once moved armies and toppled kingdoms. "Tell them we face enemies from the eastern lands, trained soldiers seeking to claim what they believe belongs to them. Any who can spare warriors should come quickly. We'll need every sword arm we can muster." But even as he spoke the words, Einar knew that traditional Viking tactics would not serve against the kind of disciplined force that the strangers represented. These were not raiders seeking quick profit or Saxon farmers defending their fields. These were imperial soldiers who had traveled across continents with a specific mission and the resources to see it completed regardless of local resistance. "What of the girl?" Thorvald asked, his aged eyes holding the wisdom of someone who had survived too many conflicts to harbor illusions about heroic last stands. "Perhaps if we—" "No." The word cut through the elder's suggestion like a blade through silk, carrying an absolute finality that surprised even Einar himself. "Liu stays under our protection. That decision is not open to negotiation or compromise." The use of her true name transformed the girl from mysterious refugee to imperial princess in the minds of everyone present, recontextualizing everything they had experienced during the long winter months. But for Einar, the titles and political implications mattered less than the simple fact that she had become his daughter in all the ways that truly counted. And no force on earth would convince him to abandon her to the mercies of men who had already murdered her family. It was Liu herself who provided the key to their survival, demonstrating once again the keen intelligence that had allowed her to escape palace assassins and survive a journey across half the world. She approached Einar as the clan warriors began their preparations for battle, her small hands carrying a collection of objects that she spread on the ground between them with ceremonial precision. "I know fighting," she said in careful Norse, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed to echo from the imperial courts where she had been born. "Palace guards teach strategy, teach how armies move, how battles won." What she revealed through a combination of words, gestures, and drawings scratched in the dirt defied everything the Vikings thought they knew about warfare. Liu had not simply observed military training during her privileged childhood. She had been educated in the strategic principles that govern conflicts between empires, taught to think in terms of supply lines and communication networks, rather than individual courage and warrior skill. "Enemy strong when together," she explained, moving small stones to represent the dispositions of forces. "But far from home, few men need messages back to uncle. If cut messages, if make look like accident, uncle think mission failed. Send no more soldiers." The plan that emerged from her knowledge was audacious in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Rather than meeting the imperial soldiers in direct battle, where their training and discipline would prove decisive, they would orchestrate what appeared to be a natural disaster, an avalanche or landslide, that would eliminate the immediate threat while making it impossible for distant commanders to determine whether their agents had succeeded or failed. "The old path above the eastern ridge," Astrid said thoughtfully, her mind immediately grasping the tactical possibilities that Liu's strategy offered. "Those slopes have been unstable since the spring thaw began. A few strategically placed charges of Greek fire could bring down enough rock to bury an army." But it was the girl's next revelation that truly demonstrated the depth of her understanding about the forces arrayed against them. She withdrew the imperial seal ring from its hiding place and held it so that its carved surface caught the firelight, then began to explain the complex web of legitimacy and succession that made her both invaluable and incredibly dangerous to her uncle's ambitions. "Ring make laws," she said carefully, her vocabulary struggling with concepts that span continents and cultures. "Uncle cannot be emperor without ring, cannot make treaties, cannot command armies from far places. But if I die, ring broken, no more empire, only small kingdoms fighting." The political implications were staggering. Liu was not simply an heir to be eliminated. She was the keystone that held together an entire imperial structure. Her death would not consolidate her uncle's power, but destroy it entirely, fragmenting the Celestial Empire into warring factions that would be too busy fighting each other to threaten distant Viking settlements. "Then, we make sure you don't die," Einar said simply, though he knew that the promise would be far easier to make than to keep. "And we make sure your uncle's agents never return to report what they found here." The preparations that followed transformed the peaceful settlement into something resembling a military camp, but with crucial differences that reflected both Viking traditions and Liu's strategic insights. Rather than preparing for a glorious battle that would be remembered in the sagas, they planned for a trap that would be forgotten by history, an apparent accident that would leave no witnesses and no evidence of deliberate action. Young Gunnar volunteered for the most dangerous part of the plan, using his knowledge of the mountain paths to position clay vessels filled with Greek fire at precisely calculated points along the unstable slope. Astrid organized the evacuation of non-combatants to hidden caves that had sheltered their ancestors during previous conflicts. And through it all, Liu worked beside them with the focused intensity of someone who understood that failure would mean not just death, but the collapse of everything she had been born to protect. Dod, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the fjord that would soon become a battlefield, Einar found himself standing once again beside the water's edge with Liu at his side. She had traded her worn refugee clothing for the practical garments of a Viking shield maiden, her dark hair braided with the same care that Astrid had once used for her own daughter's battle preparations. "Afraid?" he asked gently, knowing that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. "Yes," Liu admitted, her honesty carrying the dignity that was becoming her hallmark. "But more afraid of what happens if Uncle wins. Better to die fighting than live as prisoner." The words carried echoes of every warrior's creed, spoken in the voice of a child who had learned that sometimes the greatest battles were fought not for glory or conquest, but for the simple right to choose one's own fate. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Einar offered a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, not for victory, which was always uncertain, but for the chance to prove worthy of the trust that a lost princess had placed in an aging warrior who had never expected to be a father again. Tomorrow would bring fire and falling stone, the clash of imperial ambitions against Viking determination, and the final test of bonds that had been forged not in palace halls or warriors' training grounds, but in the quiet moments between a man who had lost everything and a child who had chosen to call him father. The shield that bore his father's legacy would protect what mattered most, or it would become a memorial to the price of standing against empires when love demanded. More courage than wisdom suggested was wise. Dawn came like the edge of a blade, sharp and cold and cutting through the last shadows of a night, spent in preparation for what might be the final battle any of them would ever fight. The Imperial soldiers returned as promised, their boat cutting through the still waters of the fjord, with the inexorable patience of men who believed victory was merely a matter of time and superior force. Einar watched their approach from his position behind the longhouse, his weathered hands checking his weapons one final time while his mind ran through the carefully choreographed sequence of events that would determine whether Liu lived free or died fighting. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Draw the soldiers into the killing ground beneath the unstable slope, trigger the avalanche that would eliminate them permanently, and ensure that no word of their fate ever reached the distant empire that had sent them. 5 men, Bjorn reported from his concealed position near the dock, his voice carrying the professional calm of a scout who had learned to deliver crucial information without emotional coloring. Same as yesterday, that they're moving differently, more cautious, weapons ready. The change in the soldiers' demeanor suggested that they too had spent the night preparing for violence, abandoning the diplomatic pretenses that had marked their initial approach. in favor of the direct methods that imperial training made inevitable. They came ashore with the coordinated precision of men who had fought together before, their leader directing the others with gesture and glance rather than spoken commands that might carry to hostile ears. "Where's the child?" the leader called, across the open ground between the dock and the longhouse, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. "We have come to complete our mission. Deliver her now, and your people may live to see another dawn." The threat was delivered with the same casual confidence that a merchant might use to discuss the price of grain, and it chilled Einar's blood in ways that more dramatic displays of hostility never could. These men killed not from passion or fury, but from professional necessity, viewing the elimination of obstacles as simply another aspect of completing their assigned tasks. "The child is under our protection," Einar replied, stepping into view with the deliberate movements of a man who had faced death so many times that it held no more terror than an old friend's visit. "She will remain so until she chooses otherwise." What followed was a conversation conducted in the universal language of men preparing for violence. The subtle shift of weight that indicated readiness to draw weapons, the careful positioning that maximized advantage while minimizing exposure, the measuring glances that calculated distances and angles with the precision of experienced killers. "You have chosen poorly," the leader observed, his tone carrying regret that seemed almost genuine. "The Celestial Empire does not forget those who defy its will. Your deaths will be quick, but your names will be remembered as warnings to others who might harbor similar delusions of heroism." It was then that Liu made her appearance, stepping from the longhouse with the composed dignity that had become her trademark. Dressed in Viking clothing, but carrying herself with the unmistakable bearing of imperial authority. The sight of her seemed to galvanize the soldiers, their careful discipline giving way to the focused intensity of hunters who had finally cornered their prey. "Princess," the leader said, his voice softening with what might have been relief or satisfaction, "you have led us a considerable chase, but it ends here. Come willingly, and these people will be spared the consequences of their misguided protection." But instead of the frightened compliance he clearly expected, Liu stepped forward with purposeful determination, her small hands visible and empty, but her posture radiating the kind of authority that empires were built upon. When she spoke, it was not in the careful Norse she had learned during her months of exile, but in the musical cadences of her native tongue, formal court language that carried weight and significance that transcended mere words. The soldiers' reaction was immediate and telling. Several took involuntary steps backward, while their leader's face went pale beneath his professional composure. Whatever Liu had said, it had struck them with the force of a physical blow, transforming their confident advance into something approaching retreat. "Impossible," the leader whispered, his voice carrying the shock of a man whose fundamental assumptions about the world had just been shattered. "The succession laws the Council of Ministers are bound by the imperial seal," Liu replied in accented but clear Norse, her young voice carrying authority that seemed to echo from the throne rooms of distant empires. "Which the first carry, and which my uncle will never possess while I live." The revelation that she not only possessed the imperial seal but understood its full political implications seemed to paralyze the soldiers with uncertainty. They had come expecting to retrieve a frightened child who could be easily controlled or eliminated, only to discover that their quarry was not just the rightful empress, but someone who clearly understood the full scope of the power she represented. It was in that moment of hesitation, when imperial discipline wavered in the face of unexpected complexity, that the trap was sprung. High above them on the eastern ridge, Gunnar's signal fire blazed to life, a pillar of flame and smoke that seemed to reach toward the morning sky like a Viking funeral pyre. The sight of it sent Liu diving toward the predetermined shelter. while Einar and his warriors scattered according to the plan they had rehearsed throughout the long night. The soldiers, trained to react to threats with lethal efficiency, responded exactly as Liu's strategic mind had predicted they would. Instead of seeking cover or retreating to safer ground, they advanced toward what they perceived as the source of danger, the signal fire that marked their position for allies who might be approaching from the land. Their disciplined charge carried then directly into the killing ground beneath the unstable slope, where clay vessels filled with Greek fire waited like sleeping dragons, ready to wake with devastating fury. The trap was set, the players were in position, and all that remained was for gravity and flame to complete what strategy and courage had begun. The mountain's roar began as a whisper, a subtle shifting of stone and earth that grew into a thunderous symphony of destruction that shook the very foundations of the fjord. Gunnar's Greek fire had done its work with devastating efficiency, triggering the avalanche that sent thousands of tons of rock cascading down the eastern slope like the wrath of gods, made manifest in stone and fury. But as the dust settled and the echoes of falling stone faded into silence, it became clear that the trap had not been as complete as they had hoped. 3 of the Imperial soldiers lay buried beneath the rubble. Their mission ended as permanently as Liu's strategic mind had intended. But 2 had survived, the leader and one of his men, both bloodied and shaken but still armed and infinitely more dangerous now that diplomatic pretenses had been abandoned entirely. "Clever child," the leader said, pulling himself from the debris, with movements that spoke of serious injury barely held in check, but not clever enough. The Empire has faced avalanches before, and emperors who thought themselves safe behind walls of stone. What followed was a confrontation that transformed the peaceful settlement into something from the fun. Darkest sagas, a battle between Imperial training and Viking fury, fought not for gold or glory, but for the simple right of a child to choose her own fate. The surviving soldiers moved with the deadly grace of men who have been shaped by warfare into weapons as finely honed as the blades they carried. Einar met the leader's charge with the accumulated skill of 4 decades spent in battles across half the known world, his father's axe singing through the morning air with the kind of precision that could only come from a lifetime of practice. But his opponent was younger, faster, and trained in fighting techniques that the northern lands had never seen. Flowing movements that turned defense into attack and made every parry the beginning of a counterattack. The duel that erupted between them was less a battle than a deadly dance, each man seeking the opening that would end the conflict with a single decisive blow. Steel rang against steel in patterns that spoke of different schools of warfare, the straightforward brutality of Viking combat meeting the subtle complexity of Imperial swordplay, in a clash that seemed to echo with the weight of civilizations in collision. It was Liu who changed the tide of battle, emerging from her concealment, not as the frightened child her enemies expected, but as something that embodied both the Imperial authority she had been born to and the Viking courage she had learned. During her months of exile, in her hands she carried not the wooden horse that had been her comfort through the long winter, but the sword of the fallen soldier, a blade forged in Imperial workshops but wielded now in defense of the freedom she had chosen over the crown that was her birthright. "I am Liu Wei," she declared, her young voice carrying across the battlefield with the authority that had once commanded armies and shaped the destinies of nations. "Daughter of the Dragon Emperor, keeper of the Celestial Seal, and I claim the right of single combat against those who would murder the innocent to advance their treachery." The challenge was delivered in the formal cadences of Imperial court protocol, invoking traditions that reach back through centuries of dynastic succession and military honor. Even in their desperate fury, the surviving soldiers could not ignore such a challenge. To do so would be to abandon not just their mission, but their very identity as servants of the empire they claimed to represent. The leader's response was swift and terrible, his blade seeking Liu's heart with the kind of precision that spoke of countless Similar executions carried out in the service of imperial necessity. But the child who met his attack was no longer the frightened refugee who had hidden in the ruins of a burned village. She was a warrior princess who had learned that survival sometimes required embracing the very violence you had spent your life fleeing from. The technique she used was pure imperial combat training, modified by months of observation as Einar and his warriors practiced their own deadly arts. She turned the leader's attack aside with a movement that seemed to flow like water around stone, then struck back with the kind of devastating counterattack that had brought honor to both her bloodline and the people who had chosen to protect her. The assassin leader's sword clattered to the ground as he fell. His mission ended not by Viking axes or imperial politics, but by the blade of the very child he had been sent to eliminate. In the sudden silence that followed, Liu stood over his body with the composure that was becoming her trademark. The captured weapon held with the natural grace of someone born to command. "It is finished," she said simply, though everyone present understood that the real battle, the struggle to forge a new identity that honored both her imperial heritage and her chosen Viking family, was only beginning. The sword she had claimed would become a symbol of that transformation, a bridge between worlds that had seemed impossibly distant until a lost princess taught them all that family was not about blood or birthright, but about the choice to stand together when standing apart would have been safer and easier. The avalanche had buried more than enemy soldiers, and had buried the last vestiges of the frightened child who had once huddled against broken walls, making room for the warrior princess who would shape the future of two peoples through the simple act of refusing to be anything less than exactly who she chose to be. The months that followed the avalanche brought changes to the fjord settlement that no one could have anticipated when Einar first pulled his boat onto the muddy shore of a burned village and found a nameless child hiding among the ruins. Summer arrived with unusual abundant trade routes that had been blocked for seasons suddenly reopened, bringing merchants eager to establish relationships with the clan that had somehow gained the favor of distant eastern kingdoms. The new family banner that flew above their longhouse told the story of that transformation better than any saga could have managed, woven by Astrid's skilled hands from silk that had arrived with the first grateful trading missions. It bore symbols that bridged two worlds, the raven of Norse tradition intertwined with the dragon of imperial authority, creating something entirely new while honoring both lineages that had shaped its creation. Liu, who had chosen to keep the name that had become her identity during the long journey from palace to fjord, stood beneath that banner on a morning when the autumn light painted the water gold and the air carried hints of the winter that would soon test the peace they had built. She wore clothing that reflected her dual nature, practical Viking wool decorated with silk embroidery that told stories and characters that few in the northern lands could read. "The letters have come again," she said, offering Einar a collection of documents that bore the seals of kingdoms he had never visited, but whose respect he had somehow earned. The correspondence had begun arriving within weeks of the avalanche, carried by merchants and diplomats who spoke of gratitude from the fragments of empire that had emerged when Liu's uncle's power collapsed without the legitimizing authority of the imperial seal. Einar accepted the letters with the bemused grace of a man who had spent his life expecting nothing more complex than the next raid or the next harvest, only to find himself designated as guardian to an empress whose very existence had reshaped the political landscape of the known world. The documents spoke of trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, of tribute offered freely by peoples who had been liberated from tyranny by the simple act of one lost child choosing freedom over power. "They still ask you to return," he observed, noting the formal language that couldn't quite hide the desperate hope of kingdoms that needed the legitimacy that only Liu's presence could provide. "And I still say no," she replied with the calm certainty that had become her trademark. An empire built on fear dies when fear ends. What grows in its place must be built on choice, not obligation. The wisdom in her words would have seemed impossible coming from the frightened child who had once eaten bread with the desperate hunger of someone who had learned not to waste opportunities for survival. But the girl who spoke now had been shaped by experiences that spanned continents and cultures, forged by the intersection of imperial education and Viking courage into something entirely unique. She had become the bridge she had once represented, only in potential teaching Eastern healing techniques to Norse settlements while learning the arts of metalwork and navigation that would have been forbidden to women in her father's court. The younger children of the clan followed her with the devotion usually reserved for the most successful warriors, eager to learn the games and stories she had brought from the other side of the world. Ragnhild approaches her 15th winter, Astrid observed, using the Norse name that Liu had chosen to complement rather than replace her birth identity. The name meant ruler's battle, and it suited someone who had learned that the greatest victories were often won not through conquest, but through the courage to build something better than what had come before. Old enough to make her own choices about the future, Einar agreed, though the words carried an ache that spoke to the part of him that would always worry about the daughter who had chosen him as completely as he had chosen her. Whatever she decides, she have our support. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, not the urgent rhythm of messengers bearing crisis, but the measured pace of someone bringing news that could wait for proper courtesy. Young Gunnar appeared around the corner of the longhouse, his face bright with the kind of excitement that usually preceded either celebration or disaster. "A boat approaches," he reported, his voice carrying the anticipation of someone who had learned to find adventure in the unexpected. Traders from the southern kingdoms, carrying goods, and a passenger who asked specifically for the household of Einar the Old Wolf and his daughter, Liu Wei. The news was intriguing rather than alarming. Visitors were common now that their settlement had gained a reputation as a place where East and West met in friendship rather than conquest. But it was Liu's reaction that transformed curiosity into something approaching wonder. Her face lit with recognition and joy, the careful composure she usually maintained giving way to something that reminded Einar of the child she had been when simple kindness could bring tears of gratitude. "Chen Ming," she whispered, the name carrying weight and significance that transcended the political implications of renewed contact with her former life. "My teacher, my friend." What followed was a reunion that spoke to bonds forged not in the formal relationships of court life, but in the genuine affection between a scholar who had shaped a young mind and the student who had grown beyond even his most optimistic expectations. Chen Ming was an elderly man whose gentle dignity spoke of wisdom earned through study rather than warfare, and his presence brought with it the promise of knowledge that could benefit both the settlement and the wider world. He had come not to retrieve an empress for distant thrones, but to learn from the remarkable synthesis she had created, the fusion of Eastern wisdom and Northern courage that suggested new possibilities for how different peoples might live together, without the need for conquest or submission. As autumn deepened toward winter, and the new family banner flew above a settlement that had become something unprecedented in the known world, Einar stood once again at the edge of the fjord, watching the play of light on water that had carried him through so many seasons of change. Beside him, Liu Ragnhild worked on correspondence that would carry news of their experiment in cultural cooperation to kingdoms and settlements across vast distances. The wooden horse that had once been her most treasured possession now sat on a shelf where visiting children could play with it freely, having been transformed from a symbol of personal comfort into something that represented the generosity that made their community unique. And in that transformation, Einar saw reflected the journey they had all taken from the isolation of cultural suspicion to the abundance that came when different peoples chose to learn from each other rather than fear what they did not understand. The circle was complete, yet also just beginning. Where once an aging warrior had brooded over losses that could never be recovered, now a father watched his daughter prepare for a future that would be shaped not by the accidents of birth or the momentum of ancient hatreds, but by the choices that brave people made when they decided to build something better than what they had inherited.